In 1797, Venice was invaded for the first time in her history by foreign troops, and by thousands of them at that. The Serenissima, the oldest republic in Europe after Roman times, ceased to exist. The last Doge resigned, taking off his ducal cap, the corno, and handing it to his valet with the words, "Take this, I shan't be needing it again." Napoleon was now the master of Italy, but in the Treaty of Campo Formio, Venice was ceded to Austria. And after being pushed about between France and Austria like the pawn she now was, in 1814, she found herself permanently attached to Austria. Austrian rule was severe, even harsh. Women who were caught making anti-Austrian statements were stripped to the waist and publicly flogged in the main squares. After their screams had subsided, salt was rubbed into their raw and bleeding backs. In theatre and opera, too, the censorship was complete. Every opera libretto had to be read for anti-establishment tendencies, and anything that the censor found to be anti-monarchical or anti-aristocratic or pro-republican was rigorously suppressed. Not surprisingly, theatre and opera became more and more dull and insipid, the Venetians more and more frivolous and ill-read.
Vi ho detto di no. Ma insomma, vi ho detto di no. Non insistete perché altrimenti vi bastone Rocky.
The canals are becoming choked up, and the stench from them at low water is often dreadful.
There is now no court or centre of government, which in the time of the Doges gave life and industry to every branch of trade in Venice.
The decadence of Venice is due to the fact that it belongs to Austria.
However, the Venetians themselves interest me. The white veils of the women thrown over their heads show from whence the painters took their first idea of the dress of the Virgin. In other respects, ancient costumes and customs are neglected. The clocks no longer strike 24 hours, and in consequence, all the hours are alike. The theatre begins at 9 o'clock, and the casino at 12.
The collapse of Venetian musical life was seen at first hand by the composer Ludwig Spohr. On a visit to Venice, he was called upon by the German musician Ablinger, who had been living there for 16 years. He complained to Spohr, almost with tears in his eyes, that in Italy he was deprived of any opportunity of keeping pace with his German contemporaries. He hardly ever had the fortune to hear an important German work, and it simply broke his heart to be bound by fate to a city where for 16 years the same music was played over and over again. Spohr felt that he might have amounted to something if he hadn't been cooped up in what he called this artistic Siberia. But Spohr did discover Venetian musical life of sorts.
There are two series of amateur concerts here. One series, under the direction of Count Tomasini, offers a concert every 2 weeks at the Theatre Fenice. The orchestra, with the exception of the basses and a few winds, consists exclusively of amateurs. It devotes itself mostly to the symphonies and overtures of German masters. One can hardly speak, however, of a serious study of these works. Just getting through without breaking down is reckoned a great success. The day I was there, I was asked to conduct Beethoven's Symphony No. 2 in B, which I could not very well refuse. It was an ordeal. The orchestra was accustomed to tempi quite different to mine, and seemed unaware of the existence of distinctions between loud and soft. Everyone scraped and blew for all he was worth. The noise was such that my ears ached all night. The smugness of the Italians, in conjunction with the paucity of their own production, is sheerly intolerable. Whenever I played one of my compositions, they knew no higher praise than to assure me that it was to the Italian taste.
No less an authority than Felix Mendelssohn reported that in Milan, they were scarcely able to get through Mozart's Don Giovanni, while the orchestral parts of Haydn's creation gave them the greatest difficulty. All in all, it was a sad time for Italian music. But in Venice, life went on in its own inimitable way.
A Venetian lady's time is thus passed. She rises about 12 o'clock, when the Cavaliere Serventi, who waits until she is awake, attends her to Mass. Few of them read anything of their prayer books. The lady then takes a few turns on the Piazza San Marco, either pays visits or receives them, and dines between 3 and 4 o'clock. She then undresses and goes to bed completely. At about 8 o'clock, she arises for her toilette, spends until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning at the theatre and the casino, or during the summer in the cafes on the piazza.
But when the century was still only 10 years old, there appeared a young man with not only the good looks to turn the heads of half the women in Venice, but the genius to wreak a total transformation in Venetian musical life. Gioachino Rossini. He got his chance one day when one of the 5 one-act operas, known as farce, that had been ordered by the Teatro San Moise, failed to turn up. And suddenly, someone remembered this bright, witty, and extremely good-looking young man who everybody said was a brilliant composer. At that time, he was playing the harpsichord in a Bologna theatre for 3 lire a night. But they brought him to Venice, signed him up, handed him the libretto, which was called La Cambiale di Matrimonio, or Marriage by Promissory Note, and told him to get on with it. Rehearsals went badly, but one of the singers told Rossini how matters could be fixed. Producing and composing operas was always very much a pragmatic affair in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and Rossini learned quickly. On November the 3rd, 1810, La Cambiale di Matrimonio took Venice by storm. The principal and overwhelming characteristic of this, Rossini's grand debut on a small scale in Venice, was its sense of fun and its irrepressible high spirits. If you don't like this music, you don't like music. Anyway, the Venetians loved it. Rossini must have been delighted to collect his fee of 2,000 lire, the equivalent of 663 evenings as harpsichord player in the Bologna Theatre. By the spring of 1812, when Rossini was already a household name in Venice, he produced a new one-act farsa entitled La Scala di Seta, the Silken Ladder. It's still in the repertoire and a much-loved early work by its composer. One aspect that interests us in the 20th century in particular is the fact that in the overture we have an early example of the famous Rossini crescendo.
Venice was Rossini's launching pad. When he first got commissions to do these little one-act farce for the Teatro San Moise, that gave him a foothold in the operatic world, and they went down very well. And then, in the year 1813, which is really one of the great operatic anni mirabiles, if you like, because it's all the birth of Verdi and Wagner. And then that saw a double triumph for Rossini with the comic opera L'Italiana in Algeri in Venice and the serious opera Tancredi. And with those two works, the Rossini fever began.
Tancredi, which opened on February the 6th, 1813, is based on a tragedy of the same name by Voltaire. The plot deals with a conflict between the Christians and the Muslims, and the Venetian public went mad over it. One of the arias, Di Tanti Palpiti, was the kind of success that composers dream of. The gondoliers sang it in the morning, the waiters sang it in the coffee houses at noon, and the aristocracy sang it in the evening.
The life of an operatic singer in the 19th century was far harder than it is today. Firstly, because they often had to perform night after night, particularly in Venice, where the climate is not the healthiest, and throat infections tended to go around. And yet, an impresario could very often force a singer who was feeling slightly under the weather to come along to the theatre. He could send the police along to him, and the police would say, come on, you out of bed, onto the theatre straight away, doesn't matter how you're feeling, that's in your contract. And the result was that on the whole, I would say that singers' careers were much shorter in those days than they are now.
But if Tancredi was a genuine popular success, Rossini's next opera, L'Italiana in Algeri, first given at the San Benedetto Theatre that very same year on the 22nd of May, proved to be the most successful opera in Italy for a generation. He had written it at the age of 21 in less than a month. All the great and former glories of Cimarosa, Paisiello, Haydn, even Mozart, all poured together into this magnificent score. A score which, from the symphonic richness of its introduction, right the way through to those compelling and irresistible patter finales, set a new standard for Italian music, arguably for music altogether. In 1836, the beautiful 18th century Teatro Fenice, which had opened its doors with an opera by the veteran composer Giovanni Paisiello in 1792, burnt down. It was immediately rebuilt, and so became the symbol of all the famous and beautiful opera houses of Venice, which gradually began to disappear during the 19th and 20th centuries, eventually leaving the Fenice in undisputed sway, rich in tradition, and still one of the sights of Venice. Ever since Venice had been the host of the first public opera house in Monteverdi's time, opera had fulfilled a unique dual function in Italian life. First of all, of course, it provided music, but it was also admirably suited for meetings and assignations of every kind. Each box was equipped with a set of folding shutters which could close it off completely, and many a Venetian baby must have been conceived behind those extraordinary folding doors. But also on a more platonic level, the opera served a useful social function. Not only could you meet your friends, you could go and gamble in the ridotto next door, you could have your dinner either in the very comfortable public rooms or in the privacy of your box, or if you got a little bored with the recitatives, nobody would object if you decided on a little quiet game of cards.
The theatres were slightly differently planned then. That's to say the stage was different. The stage would have a huge proscenium which would project about 4 meters into what we would now regard as the audience area. Also, there was no orchestral pit. The orchestra was strung out round the front of the proscenium. And there was no conductor in the early years of the century at all. I mean, the person who actually directed was the leader of the violins. The opera was really for the benefit of the people who occupied the boxes. And that explains a lot in the way certain operas were constructed. For example, if you get an aria of which the text is in parentheses, it's a kind of soliloquy. It means that the singer has to come to the very front of the stage and sing at the audience, and the other people on the stage aren't supposed to know what he's singing about. And you often find the chorus, it happens in Hernani, is sort of saying, I wonder what he's thinking about. Why does he appear to be so perturbed? All that kind of thing. It meant, in fact, that all the important music tended to be sung right from the front of the stage, even if that didn't make an awful lot of dramatic sense. And another thing is that you always have these pauses after a big aria that has been sung from the front of the stage, and the singer, everything would be held up while the singer took a bow, and if the music was really liked, then the composer was asked to come forward, and he would take a bow as well. There would be cries of "Fuori Maestro."
Spoilt as the Venetians were by Rossini's superbly civilized comedies and tragedies, an even greater excitement was in store for them. The arrival on the scene of Italy's greatest opera composer of all time, Giuseppe Verdi. By the mid-19th century, Giuseppe Verdi had presented two new operas in Venice. The first was based on one of the greatest works of early romantic drama, Ernani by Victor Hugo, and it had its opening performance on the 9th of March 1844 at the Teatro La Fenice. As always, during those dark, repressive days, Verdi had trouble with the censors. And as always, by dint of hard bargaining, giving way at one point, remaining inflexible at another, he managed to negotiate an eventual agreement without too much harm being done.
Verdi, you could say, had a special relationship with Venice. That's to say, his first really worldwide success opera was written for Venice, and that is Ernani. And the interesting thing about Ernani is that of all his early works, his 15 or 16 early works, it is the only one which went on being performed right through the century during Verdi's lifetime and afterwards. I mean, operas like Nabucco and Foscari and even Macbeth, they really had to wait for the Verdi revival. But Ernani went on being performed. And another thing, Verdi, I think, risked more for Venice than he did for other opera houses, because he could be certain that the authorities would always give him plenty of rope. He could get away with things in Venice that he certainly couldn't get away with elsewhere. And so he chose very bold subjects.
In 1846 came Attila. Once again it was a triumphant success, the jubilant Venetians yelling "Italia, Italia" as they saw the Huns swallowed up in the lagoons of their beloved city. Thus it was natural that in 1850 the directors of La Fenice should approach Verdi for a new opera for the 1851 season. Verdi chose another story by Victor Hugo, Le Roi s'amuse, and then began working on his new opera in the autumn of 1850. When he heard about the subject, the president of the Fenice, Mazzari, was sure that the censors would object. The play was about a frivolous and dissolute king, a loose girl who sleeps with him, and a hideous hunchback, Triboulet. In fact, the censors had a fit. Both sides raged, but both made sensible compromises. The king was turned into the Duke of Mantua, and the hunchback Triboulet became at first Triboletto and finally Rigoletto.
It was felt to be an extremely immoral play. And the reason why I think it was felt to be immoral was, though Rigoletto gets his comeuppance all right, the Duke, who is a complete libertine, he just gets away scot-free. And so Verdi had endless trouble. At one point, the authorities said forbade the subject absolutely outright. However, then the usual changes were made of locale and period, and he got away with it, but only, or I say only in Venice. What I mean is that in a great many other theatres, the whole thing had to be censored. And Rigoletto was called Viscardello somewhere else, and there the ambience was changed to England, and the Duke was, well, perhaps a rather fickle character, but by no means an immoral character. And Gilda didn't die at the end, all that sort of thing.
In the last act, the Duke walks into the tap room and asks for wine, a room, and a girl to sleep with. All, naturally, toned down in the final version. But nevertheless, Rigoletto, which saw the light of day at La Fenice on the 11th of March, 1851, proved an operatic revolution.
La donna è mobile, quale piuma al vento, muta d'accento e di pensiero, sempre un'amabile, leggiadro viso, il pianto e il riso, e menzognero. La donna è mobile, quale piuma al vento, muta d'accento e di pensiero.
Verdi came to Venice countless times in his life, but he never really stayed here very long, which has led people to assume that his Venetian visits weren't somehow terribly important, but were little more than interludes between his far more important successes and failures in Rome and Naples and Milan. But in fact, that's not true at all, because Verdi's visits, short as they may have been, were almost invariably of considerable importance, not only to his own career, but also to the whole history of Italian opera. On the 6th of March, 1853, La Fenice was again the host to a new and important work by Giuseppe Verdi, La Traviata. The composer had worked feverishly on it, and it was one of the worst fiascos in operatic history. Verdi confirmed this himself after the premiere.
The end result was a fiasco, a total fiasco. I can't say who is to blame. Better not to talk about it.
This was the first time that anyone had written an opera with a consumptive heroine. And that was bold, because you see, consumption was actually one of the scourges of the age, and people were made very uneasy by it. And for the first performance, I think there's no doubt that Verdi had overplayed his hand over that, and he complained that there was laughter. Well, they say it's because the prima donna was too plump to suggest somebody dying of consumption. Well, that may have come into it, but I think also the laughter was due simply to a sense of unease at so bold a subject being treated.
Only 14 months after that disastrous premiere, another famous Venetian theatre, the Theatre of San Benedetto, staged La Traviata to thundering applause. At the second performance, it was reported that
The enthusiasm is indescribable. The same audience that first condemned the work now pride themselves on having known all along what a marvelous opera it always was.
Was 19th century Venice really as bad as that? Perhaps it was, but better times were on the way, and in 1866 Venice shook off the Austrian yoke and became, for the first time, part of the United Italy. The crowds that cheered King Victor Emmanuel's arrival in the city in the late autumn of 1866 were also celebrating the end of half a century of humiliation. Perhaps it was a consequence of Venice's sad decline that all the principal figures on the musical scene were non-Venetians. Gone were the days when Venice herself and her native sons were at the center of musical activities. The city, in its musical as well as in its theatrical life, was becoming a museum. And there's another sad fact as well. If we have confined ourselves exclusively to opera in this program, it's for a very good reason. There wasn't anything else.
It's very extraordinary, but for example, in the 1870s, when orchestral concerts just started, and nobody knew how to build a symphony concert in those days. I mean, it was just a collection of miscellaneous items and arrangements of Boccherini's Minuet for full strings or Mozart's Rondo alla Turca and all that sort of thing. It was a complete mishmash of items. And I think it was at Lucca, where Puccini was born and grew up, that somebody decided to include a movement from a Haydn quartet in the course of a concert. And the critic the next day blamed the players for sitting round in a group and playing to each other instead of coming and standing in a line at the footlights and playing out towards the audience. Well, I mean, that just shows you how much the quartet meant to Italians, even as late as 1870.
In fact, Italians were getting more and more out of touch with musical life abroad. They imported Wagner operas in German and had them translated, but it was very un-Italian, and there was a rather eerie story of Verdi listening in a curtained box to a Wagner opera at the Bologna Theatre, and then leaving when it was over without saying a word. Importation now became the great Venetian speciality. They imported tourists by the thousands and developed that classic love-hate relationship between them and us, which exists to this very day. It was the same thing with the resident artists. Many of them were English and German, and the great musical celebrities who now came to Venice were not only not Venetians, but not even Italians. Among the visitors to Venice in 1877 was Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who arrived towards the end of November. He was enthralled by the quiet of the city, and especially by the Venetian evenings with the soft gas lights in the shops. He also found it a good place to work, and managed there to complete the scoring of Act 2, Scene 1 of Eugene Onegin. After an interlude in Vienna, he returned again to Venice, but the trip had been desperately uncomfortable, and this time he felt so miserable on arriving that he proceeded, in true Russian fashion, to get hopelessly drunk. And not once, either. In the last half of the 19th century, the most celebrated German operatic composer of the day, Richard Wagner, visited Venice, a city that he loved deeply. It was, however, to be his final visit. Extracts from the diary of his wife, Cosima, tell us of the coming end.
16th of September, 1882. At 2:30, Richard and I are in Venice. It is grey, but the city and the Palazzo Vendramin please.
Wagner had rented quarters in the Palazzo Vendramin, which is next to the Music Conservatory.
Of September. Terrible stormy night. In the morning we go to Vendramin and install ourselves there. At 1 o'clock a strong downpour makes us doubt if we can use a gondola, but the gondoliers calm us down and achieve a real Meisterstück. 25th of September. Richard's pleasure in Venice and our lodging grows every day. The palazzo opposite us has one story just as he likes it. He loves the house and the sea over the garden. The gondolas gliding along he finds charming. It is wonderful to live close to so much beauty. We sit between the columns of St. Mark's Square, Richard's favourite spot. 31st of October, 1882. Richard gets me up at 4 in the morning to look at the comet. A dream night. The comet, the Big Dipper, Orion, full of moonlight, mild air, and absolute calmness.
Wagner was now very ill. His heart trouble made him angry and irritable, and he ate and drank everything that was forbidden. His father-in-law, Franz Liszt, was also in Venice when Richard was preparing a performance of his long-lost but recently rediscovered Symphony in C major of 1832. It was to be a special performance in honor of Cosima's birthday at the Fenice Theatre. There were 5 rehearsals, and the Conservatoire had put up a price for the orchestra, which prompted Liszt to write about the vile sordidness and rascality of the Venetians. During the last rehearsal, on the 22nd of December, 1882, Wagner had a heart attack. Nevertheless, he managed to conduct the performance for his invited guests on Christmas Eve. On 6th of February, 1883, he went out, for the children's sake, to see the last night of Carnival. But by now, he was gravely ill. On the 13th of February, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he sent a message to the others that they were to begin lunch without him, since he was not feeling well. Then, suddenly, he rang his bell twice, in a very agitated fashion. The maid, Betty, answered it. Her master had said, "Ring the doctor and my wife." Cosima rushed to his arms, and the doctor was sent for. The family were sitting in shocked silence in the drawing room when Georg, the manservant, came in and said, "Der Meister ist tot," the master is dead. Cosima had gone in and found her husband racked with pain. Apparently a blood vessel in his heart had burst. He tried to mutter words which sounded like meine Uhr, which nowadays people seem to think meant my watch. It seems to me much more likely that he was trying to say that his last hour had come and he knew it. After that, she thought that he'd fallen asleep, but by that time the doctor had arrived, took the pulse, and found that it had stopped. Cosima, of course, was desolate. She refused to eat or to drink, or even for more than 24 hours to be separated from the body. Eventually, they managed to get her away. It was embalmed, and then she returned, cut off her hair, and laid it on her husband's breast. On the 16th of February, 1883, the funeral cortege moved silently along the Grand Canal to the station and to the train which would take Richard Wagner slowly back to Bayreuth. Venice now had the atmosphere of a slightly haunted museum. The inner life had gone out of the city. It had no real raison d'être. In the winter evenings, when the cold, damp wind blew across the cheerless squares, the city seemed not only deserted, but even faintly sinister. Its life seemed to be ebbing away. Its warmth fled across the lagoon to the little island of Murano, where the Venetians continued, as they had for centuries, to produce the glass for which they were famous. But a new revolution was in store for them. New industries which would make Murano look insignificant indeed. Industries based not on any island, but on terra firma, the mainland, where the huge industrial zone of Maestro and Marghera would threaten to consume Venice herself and even bring about her downfall. District of northwest Venice.